Hey guys, this is Chaos Chrono, back with another AOA display opening. We're on to display number 6. Halfway through this case we got here. Still looking for those awesome Jenga decks or any other big combo decks, so we're going to see what we got in today's display. While I crack everything open and label it all, just want to plug in my podcast with my team, Team ESP. We're on Spotify and YouTube, so come check us out if you're looking for additional Keyforge content. Moving on to our first deck, we have Fremont, the Obelisk Dragontamer. It is a Logo, Sanctum, and Shadows deck. Starting with Amber Generation, we have 14 pips of Amber. Supporting cards include Binate Rupture, Cutthroat Research for its effect, 2 copies of Eureka, Interdimensional Graft, Gamgee, Nerve Blast, and Ronnie, Swindle, Umbra, and Yangtze Gang, giving me a total of about 25. For Amber Control, we have Cutthroat Research, Interdimensional Graft, Take Hostages, Gamgee, Nerve Blast, Ronnie, Swindle, Umbra, and Yangtze Gang, with Key Cost Control in Proclamation 346E, giving me a total of about 9. For Artifact Control, we do have Neutron Shark, so that's a solid 1. For Creature Control, we have Direct Removal in Bouncing Deathquark, Neutron Shark, Nerve Blast, Whistling Darts, and Oubliette, with supporting cards like Radiant Truth to stun the board, giving me a total of about 5 for Creature Control. For Speed, we have Lab Work, Sutterkin, Wild Wormhole, COX Researcher, 2 copies of Eureka, Fila the Researcher, 2 copies of Dusk Chronicles, and support cards like Grey Rider and Sigil of Brotherhood. So overall speed, I'm rating it about a 10. Now looking at this deck, we do have the Brig combo in Logos, which is very nice. Amber Generation, Control, and Speed are strong points of this deck. Unfortunately, it is lacking in Creature Control or Board Control in general. With Bouncing Deathquark and only 14 creatures, that might be a bit too much of a cost on the board, but sometimes necessary. 2 copies of Hallowed Shield without many fighters, as well as the 2 copies of Shield of Justice, also limit how much benefit we can get out of those cards. There's only really 4 in-house Sanctum creatures that we can combo those with, and maybe play with Grey Rider to use 1 creature out of house. Cool part is Eureka, 2 copies of Eureka, which is nice for speed, but having double alpha is something I'm not really too fond of. If I was to get any alpha card in doubles, Eureka would probably be the one I would okay. To summarize, it's a solid toolkit race deck, but I hope for more of a board wipe and better support cards. But all in all, it's a very, very strong deck, so I'm going to rate it at about a 70. Moving on to deck number 2, we have Juleen, Critic of the Weak Fjord. Hope I pronounced that right. It's a Brobnar, and Shadows deck. For Amber Generation, we have again 14 pips of Amber. For supporting cards, we have Schuler, A Fair Game, Swindle, Umbra, Yangtze Gang, and Treasure Map for its effect. Overall, I'm rating it about a 20, maybe more, just depending on how well some of these cards hit. Unfortunately, Treasure Map isn't necessarily the most consistent unless it's one of the first cards played. For Amber Control, we have Grok, Schuler, Swindle, Umbra, Yangtze Gang, and for Key Cost Control, Lash of Broken Dreams. Supporting cards include Amber Imp, just to mess with the reaping. So overall, I'm going to rate the Amber Control about 6. For Artifact Control, we do have Poltergeist, which is a solid 1 for me, though could be rated higher because it's a use and destroy effect. Creature Control, we have Direct Removal in the 1-2 Punch, Bramo, Coward's End, 2 First Bloods, Phoenix Heart, Call of the Weak, Unlock Gateway, Life for a Life, Whistling Darts, and Bone Rot Venom. Supporting cards include Relentless Assault, Hysteria, and Lights Out to bounce creatures back or to support those fight-based removals. All in all, the creature control is pretty solid, but I'm rating it about a 10, just based off of how I feel some of these cards will hit or not. So with speed, we have Dusk Chronicles. Essentially, that's it, but we do have chains that come with Coward's End. Some support cards, we have the 2 copies of Exhume, A Fair Game, and the Spy Master, with some disruption in the 2 copies of Streak, Hysteria, and A Fair Game. Overall, I'm going to rate the speed at about a 2. Now looking at the highlights, we do have good Amber Generation and Creature Control in this deck. However, it is lacking in Amber Control and Speed. So So nothing else that's really eye-catching in terms of well-performing parts of the deck or combos, but we do have a few things that I'm not too fond of, such as the double alpha with First Blood. While we do have 4 creatures in Brobnar, that is pretty low of a count to make First Blood effective for its features, and in a house that's already based around destroying the opponent's board, First Blood is an alpha card that doesn't necessarily give all that much more value to the house, in my opinion. We'd have 2 copies of Exhume with Bramble and Schuler as the main targets for play effects. But otherwise, there's other creatures you can bring back just for the fact of having them on the board. But yeah, primarily for Exhume, you'd want to have strong play effects to pair with them. To summarize, the deck has good Amber generation and overall toolkit, but it's lagging that Amber control and speed, so it's going to be a little inconsistent with these specs. And overall, I'm going to rate it about a 60. Moving on to deck number 3, we have Zephyr, Tickle, Palenet. It's a Mars, Shadows, and Untamed deck. For Amber generation, we have 11 pips of Amber. Supporting cards include a Mind Warper, Furtive Investors for its effect, Gamgee, Sucker Punch that can repeat, Swindle, Umbra, Guard Disguise, 3 copies of Darna, Rustnar, and Lifeweb for its effect, giving me a total of about 21 for Amber generation, maybe more, depending on how well these cards can be utilized. For Amber control, we have Mind Warper, Gamgee, Swindle, Umbra, Guard Disguise, and Lifeweb. Supporting cards include 2 copies of Shockworm and the Amber Conduction unit. So overall, for Amber control, we're only looking at about a 4. For artifact control, we have Rustnar, so that's 0.5. And for creature control, we have Carpet Flotsam, Mother Gun, Tickle Beam Buckler, Plague Master, Sucker Punch, Save the Pack, and Lupo, with supporting cards like Nepenthe Seed for recursion. So overall, creature control, I'm rating about a 6. For speed, we have 2 copies of Dust Chronicles, and supporting cards like the Proliferator, and 3 copies of Regrowth. So all in all, the speed is about a 3 for me. With this deck, one of the best parts is the Amber generation. The 3 copies of Regrowth work really well with the Lupo and the 3 Darnas, along with Tickle Beam Buckler for an option outside the house, but usually you would use Regrowth for an in-house option. So with Darna, we can maximize the number of times we can hit that effect for the play effect and gaining Amber. Unfortunately, all the control and speed stats in this deck are a little worse and more situational based off the card pool. We have 2 Shockwords and ACU. Once again, we've seen a deck like this before, or a Mars kit like this before, where there's too many duplicates of the same effect, where yes, it can make it more consistent, but it's eating up a lot of tool space that the deck could have for something that's a bit more endgame friendly, rather than just pure disruption that only affects one target. And they don't stack, they don't hit multiple targets beyond by having more than one copy on the field. So there's no value there other than consistency. There's 2 bad pennies without a specific use. No Life for a Life or any other card that can really capitalize on bad pennies destruction effect, which make them relatively useless in this deck. Just another 2 bodies that are potential targets for your opponent's cards, and to clog up your hand if they bounce it back. So not a fan of having those 2 cards there. Without having too many targets of friendly creatures that have higher power, the Darna will probably not generate as much for this deck as we would hope. So overall, I'm going to rate this deck at about a 57. Moving on to deck number 4, we have Disbane, Jingwei, Graveyard, Falconer. It's a Brobnar, Dis, and Sanctum deck. We have, for Amber generation, 11 pips of Amber. And then supporting cards include Fuzel, Blood Money, Dust Imp, and 2 copies of Misery Exploit and Schuler, giving me a total about 19 or more Amber for expected generation. For Amber control, we have Schuler, Maruk the Marked, Take Hostages, and Gatekeeper, with supporting cards including the 2 Summaries. So overall, for Amber control, I'm looking at about a 4. There is no artifact control in this deck, but there is a lot of creature control though. So we have 1/2 Punch, 2 copies of Bramo, Flamewake Shaman, Ogopogo, Rock Crawling Giant, 2 copies of Call of the Week, an Unlock Gateway, 2 copies of Gunguzel, 3 Fates, and a Vemos Lightbringer, along with supporting cards like Hysteria, Blinding Light, and Radiant Truth, that all really do creature control as well, just in a different form. All I'm going to rate the creature control about a 16. For speed, we have supporting cards like Brobnar and the Grey Rider to help with recursion, and disruption in Tezmal, but no direct speed impacts from cards that let you draw, archive, or discard cards from outside the house from your hand to help you draw more. So overall speed is still 0, but we do have some support cards. The highlights of this deck, we have good Amber control and creature control. We have the Gangrenaught combo, which is fun. We have Dreadnought with 2 Bramo, so again more targets than just Ganger Chieftain, depending on the situation you're in. We have 2 copies of Misery Exploit with spot damage, so cards like Bramo, Flamelink Shaman, things that deal spot damage in and around areas, Gungoozle, all that plays well into Misery Exploit and having your opponent hold on to a damaged board to help you generate. We have 2 copies of Lion Boutrum, which help with survivability for our large creatures. And Vimos Lightbringer as a wipe for elusive creatures, and we only have 1 elusive creature in Tezmal. Everybody else is not elusive, so we're not likely going to hit our own creatures. In Tezmal, while great disruption is not a key part to the end game of this deck. The unfortunate parts is the lack of Amber control, artifact control, and low speed. We also have Unlock Gateway, which is not a good wipe, in my opinion, especially in a deck that wants to hold the board. So you're going to potentially find yourself in a situation where you get behind, your opponent has some good removal options, and you need to wipe the board to catch up, and all you got is Unlock Gateway. You're going to hurt yourself too while you're at it, and you give initiative to your opponent for the next turn. So all in all, not a great wipe in my opinion, but better than having nothing. We have 3 Fates, again a card that doesn't synergize with this deck. Since we do have a bunch of larger creatures, there is a higher chance that the 3 Fates is going to hit ourselves rather than the opponent's deck. So all in all, this deck has solid combos to generate Amber and control the board. However, the lack of Amber control paired with low speed and a lack of artifact control leaves areas of this deck that can be exploited by your opponent. So overall, I'm going to rate this deck at a 65. Moving on to deck number 5, we have Pzirishk, the Radically Rustic. Hope I pronounced that right. It's a Logos, Shadows, and Untamed deck. For Amber generation, we're looking at 15 pips of Amber. We have supporting cards in the 2 copies of Cutthroat Research, 2 copies of Furtive Investors, Nerve Blast, Throwing Stars, 3 copies of Umbra, Darna, and Full Moon, totaling about 22 expected Amber, if not more. For Amber control, we have the 2 Cutthroat Research, the Nerve Blast, and 3 Umbras. So overall, Amber control is actually going to be just rated at 4. For artifact control, we have Grasping Vines, which is half a point there. For creature control, we have 2 copies of Poke, a Nerve Blast, Sucker Punch, Throwing Stars, 2 Whistling Darts, and Save the Pack. So giving me a creature control number about 5. Speed, we have Igor, Hex Beyond, 2 copies of Poke, Director of ZYX, Memory Chip, 2 Research Smokos, Master the Theory, Dust Chronicles, and supporting cards like Rocket Boots, Song of Spring, Gravit Cycle, with Disruption and Perplexing Sophistry. So overall speed, I'm going to rate about a 10. Now with this deck, we have good Amber generation and speed. We have low creature counts, which supports the race style deck. Amber burst potential and Untamed to go with key cheats is great to see. We have Full Moon with 4 to 5 possible creatures, obviously not going to count Dusk Witch on a turn to forge with. The Darna is not likely to generate all that much because of a lack of large creatures. Unfortunately for this deck, we have poor Amber control. It's a bit situational like the Cutthroat Research, and otherwise very board heavy. Are board based without any protection to keep them on the board either. So overall, I'm looking at this deck as a good race deck with great burst potential, but it's likely weak against decks that increase the cost of keys because there is a maximum it can burst into, and we don't have much artifact control either. So if the opponent has any artifact control or artifact cards that increase key costs like Proclamation 346E, we might be a little hurting from that. So I'm gonna rate this deck at about a 60. For deck number 6, we have Statorius the Focused. It's a Brobnar and Sanctum deck. For Amber generation, we're looking at 8 pips of Amber with supporting cards like Fuzel, 3 copies of Dust Imp, and Misery Exploit, giving me about 15 for total Amber generation, maybe more. For Amber control, we have 2 Groaks, and 2 Obey the Grips, along with Grunt Buggy to control key cost, with 6 possible creatures, all in Brobnar, that can work to this effect. We have supporting cards in the form of 2 Summaries, giving you a total Amber control about 6. There is unfortunately no artifact control in this deck, and for creature control we have direct removal in Coward's End, 2 copies of First Blood, Bilgrim Avalanche potentially, Gungoozle, Soulkeeper, Collar of Subordination, Smite, and Spider. For supporting cards we have Gauntlet of Command, Relentless Assault, Hallowed Shield, and Potion of Invulnerability. So overall creature control I'm looking at about an 8. For speed we have a Yerk, but also Chains from Coward's End, and supporting cards like the Grave Rider, along with disruptive cards like Biting Irons, Tesmal, Bloodshard, and Gungoozle. So overall speed I'm just going to rate at a 0. For highlights, we have average Amber generation, Amber control, and creature control. But the Amber control is kind of on the lower end, and artifact control is lacking, along with a slow speed. So lack of features in other houses to affect Grunt Buggy is kind of a downer as well, because we'll be heavily reliant on the Brobnar creatures staying on the board to control your opponent's key costs. And again, this key cost control item is a double-edged sword, so it's not always great to have in the first place. Other interesting points is the 3 copies of Dust Imp, which is pretty nice. But otherwise, nothing else stands out. So overall, I'm gonna say this is a bit of a slow deck with only board-based Amber control, and it's gonna struggle to maintain that control. There is also a lack of a board wipe in case this deck falls behind on the board, so that's gonna be, again, a detriment to this deck. Overall, I'm gonna rate this deck at about a 52. For deck number 7, we have the Private of Redstone. It's a Brobnar Logos and Sanctum deck. For Amber generation, we're looking at 8 pips of Amber, with supporting cards like Foozle, The Flex, Binding Rupture, and Martyr's End, giving me a total of about 15 or more Amber depending on how those cards are used. For Amber control, we have Groke, Screech Bomb, Obey the Grim, Warden the Redeemed, Take Hostages, and Doorstep to Heaven, giving me about 6 for Amber control. Supporting cards included there are the Summaries, essentially. Once again, there is no artifact control in this deck. For creature control, we have direct removal in Pound, Gargantus Scrapper, and Standardized Testing. Supporting cards include Calfine, Tremor, Relentless Assault, Hallowed Shield, and Shield of Justice, giving me a total of about 3. For speed, we have Lab Work, Wild Wormhole, Brain Eater, Philo the Researcher, and Research Smoko, giving me a total of about 6, with supporting cards like Archimedes and Sigil of Brotherhood. So overall, we have a couple of good items in here. We have Redacted with more Logos creatures, so you're more likely to have a Logos turn based off the board to increase those counts so you can forge a key with Redacted. We have Lollop with the Flex, which is always a nice combination to see. And Doorstep to Heaven as one of those hard Amber controls is always nice to see as well. Overall, all specs are kind of low, so that's a bit unfortunate. And while that's the case, there isn't anything particularly bad. So overall, I'm going to rate this deck at a 55. Moving on to deck number 8, we have Revovoxel, the Morbid Maze Thief. It's a Brobnar, Discs, and Shadows deck. For Amber generation, we're looking at 8 pips of Amber, with supporting cards like 2 copies of the War Chest, 2 Shulers, a Tentacus, a Fair Game, Nerve Blast, 2 Ronnies, 2 Dusk Runners, and the Sting, giving me a total of about 18 for Amber generation. For Amber control, we have Groke, 2 Shulers, Tentacus, Nerve Blast, 2 Ronnies, a Miasma, and 2 Dusk Runners. So overall, Amber control, I'm rating about a 7. For artifact control, we do have a Tentacus, so I'm going to give that a 0.5. And for creature control, we have 2 copies of 1-2 Punch, Pain Reaction, Collar of Subordination, Life for a Life, Nerve Blast, and Whistling Darts. Supporting cards include Bingo Bang Bang, Gauntlet of Command, and 2 Lollips. So overall creature control, I'm going to rate about a 6. For speed, we have a Fair Game and Dusk Chronicles, with some disruption in the 2 copies of Binding Irons, Streak, and Tesmal. So overall speed, I'm going to rate at a 2 just for the first 2 cards. As for highlights, we have good potential Amber generation and decent Amber control with a board presence. Once again, we have that Ganger Knot combo, which is nice. We have a double War Chest, which with the Brobnar set seems like it can perform pretty well for Amber generation. We have good disruption with taunt cards to protect some of those more important creatures like the Drummernaut, the Bingo Bang Man for board control, Streak and Tesmal for disruption, and so on. Or whatever creatures we throw those Dusk Runners on. We have Amber Control spread across all 3 houses, so there's always a tool that we could use, but some of them are kind of situational. Grove needs to be on the board to be used. The Shielders require the opponent to have 4 more Amber. The Shadows ones are the most consistent and the most effective. The unfortunate part is that we're lacking creature removal or like a wipe, and it's a bit slow with limited artifact control. It's lacking that big Amber Control card as well, like the Doorstep we saw earlier, or too much to protect in this case. The Sting without ways to remove it outside of the Shadows house is a bit limiting, as you're going to need to double call Shadows to make it work, which is a risky play at times, especially as Amber Control is a fundamental part of the game that most decks will probably have. There also isn't any archiving in this deck to help with strategically timing cards that you would need down the road, so unfortunately you're going to have to just decide based off whatever hand comes in at the time. So overall, the synergy in this deck has a lot of potential. It's just lacking a couple of key cards that would take this deck to the next level, things like a board wipe or hard Amber Control. So overall, I'm going to rate this deck at a 67. Moving on to deck number 9, we have HRH Bombglow, the Cold Advisor. It's a Brobnar, Shadows, and Untamed deck. Looking at Amber generation, we have 11 pips of Amber. Supporting cards include Gamgee, 2 copies of Nerve Blast, Throwing Stars, 2 copies of Umbra, 2 copies of Darna, Amber Spy Mongrel, and Soldiers to Flowers, giving me a total of about 20 for Amber generation, maybe more. For Amber Control, we have Burn the Stockpile, Gamgee, 2 copies of Nerve Blast, and 2 Umbras. Supporting cards include Little Rapskull. So overall, I'm going to rate the Amber Control at about a 5. Once again, there is no artifact control in this deck. For creature control, we have, for direct removal, 2 copies of First Blood, Pound, Bellowing Patricate, Life for a Life, 2 copies of Nerve Blast, and Throwing Stars, with supporting cards like Tremor, Lights Out, Persistence Hunting, and Penpaka Enga. Overall, I'm going to rate the creature control at about an 8. For speed, we have Hidden Stash that directly impacts draw, play, and archive. Supporting cards include the 2 copies of Song of Spring, and we have Disruption again in Little Rapskull and Subtle Maul. So overall speed, I'm still going to rate about a 1. Other highlights, we have overall good Amber generation. We have big bottom bodies to work with Darna for generation. Penpaka also helps with that cause as well. We have 2 copies of Darna and Soldiers to Flowers to kind of go with Key Charge for that burst generation into a key cheat. Unfortunately, we do have a lack of control and speed. So again, we don't have that big Amber Control card. We also don't have taunts to protect key creatures like Umbra or Gamgee. And once again, we have a double alpha in First Blood, one of the less favorable ones in my opinion. And once again, with a relatively low Brobnar creature count. Not the lowest, but it's on a lower end. To summarize, this is a slower deck with good Amber generation and creature control, but it needs to try to keep the Umbras on the board for more consistent Amber control before the opponent's pool kind of gets out of hand. So overall, I'm going to rate this deck at about a 60. Moving on to deck number 10, we have Deimxha Zish, the Segmented and Sleek. It's a Dis, Mars, and Sanctum deck. For Amber generation, we have 12 pips of Amber. And for supporting cards, we're looking at Mars Needs Amber for its effect, and Mind Warper, giving me a total of about 14 estimated, maybe more depending on how hard the Mars Needs Amber hits. For Amber Control, we have Charette, Pandemonium, Mars Needs Amber, Mind Warper, Board and the Redeemed, Maruk the Mark, and Gatekeeper, along with key control costs in Lash of Broken Dreams and Proclamation 346E, giving me a total of about 8 for Amber Control. For Artifact Control, we have Destroy Them All, so that's a solid 1. For creature control, we have direct removal in the 2 copies of Banish, 2 copies of Call the Weak, Tixel Beambuckler, Destroy Them All, Sample Collection, Zookeeper, Plague Master, and Smite. Supporting cards include the 2 copies of Lion Boutram, Blinding Light, 2 copies of Golden Aura, and Sigil of Brotherhood. All in all, I'm going to rate the creature control at about a 10. For speed, we have York, and supporting cards like Exhume, Proliferator, and 2 copies of Mars First. We also have disruptive cards like Binding Irons and Streak. Overall speed, I'm just going to rate about a 2 for those cards. As for highlights, we do have great creature control in this deck. We have combos like the Glixel Proliferator with a 2 Mars first to archive any Mars cards that you may need to recur, which can include that other copy of Mars first. We also have a fun combination between No Drone with Zookeeper and Sample Collection. It's kind of like a 2-step creature purge, which is kind of cool, but definitely a bit slow. Aside from that, all the stats once again in this deck are kind of low. There is anti-synergy in this deck in the archiving portion, as well as you're trying to archive your opponent's creatures off the board, but at the same time, there's cards that make you archive your own cards. We also have Plague Master that hits the friendly Sanctum creatures, so some anti-synergy there. For Amber Control, it's all capture based, so it's only a delay. We never really diminish the opponent's Amber pool to any extent, maybe with Mind Warper, but nothing else to capture from their own side or just steal or make them lose Amber. We're also missing a board wipe and hard Amber control. So overall, it's a slower deck that relies on combos to generate and control the board, but it's quite lacking in the Amber control department aside from key costs and capture. So overall, I'm going to rate this deck at a 60, but it's a little hit or miss. Next, we have deck number 11, Kenhawk Station Recordkeeper. It's a Brobnar Logos and Mars deck. For Amber Generation, we're looking at 8 pips of Amber, with support cards like the Flex, 2 copies of Binate Rupture, Cutthroat Research for its effect, and Harvester, giving me a total of about 14 for Amber Generation. For Amber Control, we have Cutthroat Research. That's it. So it's just a 1. There is no artifact control in this deck. And for creature control, we have Direct Removal in Bramo, Coward's End, Phoenix Heart, 2 copies of Carpet Flotsam, 2 copies of Tixel Beambuckler, Exterminate, 2 copies of Key Abduction if you're playing against Mars, and Zookeeper, with supporting cards like 1-2 Punch. And in this case, it's supported because there's no other stunning ability. For speed, we have Igor, Wild Wormholes, UIX Researcher, Fila the Researcher, and Sloppy Lab Work, giving us a total of about 5. So for highlights, it's got good board control. Again, it's a little situational, but it's there. We also have some speed to the deck, but not all that much. Otherwise, there isn't too much going on for this deck in particular, at least for the good components. I think the Brobnar's kind of solid, but everything else is not necessarily so. So for the bad, we do have poor Amber Generation, Amber Control, and Artifact Control, which are like key parts of this game. We have a double Binate Rupture with no way to control the opponent's Amber pool, so it's a lot of generation that can hurt us instead of help us in the long run. The fun part is that there is a Redacted, so that's a yay, that's a plus. But all in all, this deck feels like a mismatched set of cards that doesn't really show much synergy and has a severe lack of Amber control. Without significant speed, this deck's not going to do much in this life. Like, if you don't have Amber control, you really need to run to the finish line. And if you can't run, then that's going to be a tough race to win. So overall, I'm going to rate this deck at a 48. Moving on to our last deck, we have Maelfiel, the Cardinal of Neutrality. It's a Brobnar, Mars, and Sanctum deck. For Amber Generation, we're looking at 11 pips of Amber, along with supporting cards like Take That Smart Defense for its effect, the Harvester, and Martyr's End. Overall, expected Amber is still only about 13 at most. For Amber Control, we have Groke, Burn the Stockpile, Take That Smarty Pants maybe, Borden the Redeemed, 2 copies of Take Hostages, and Baron McGavin. So overall, for Amber Control, we're looking at about a 5. Once again, there is no artifact control in this deck, seeing a trend here at the end. For creature control, we have Direct Removal in Bramo, Pound, Carpet Flotsam, Containment Field, Orbital Bombardment, Flotsam Spike, and Zookeeper. Supporting cards include 2 copies of Bingo Bang Bang, Into the Fray, Mindworm, 2 copies of Shield of Justice, and Lord Golgotha. Overall creature control, I'm going to rate about an 8. For speed, we have Brobnar Ambassador and some disruption with the Amber Conduction Unit and Stormcrawler. So I'll just rate the speed at about a 1. And for highlights, in terms of the good, we do have a decent amount of creature control. And we have that Brobnar Bramble combo, and 21 creatures to go with the Martyr's End. So if we are ahead on the board, then we have a good chance of hitting a good Martyr's End, helping us generate. Some of the unfortunate parts, we have Carpet Flotsam and Flotsam Spike in a deck that wants to stay on the board. So those cards would be a lot more useful in a race deck, a way to kind of wipe the opponent's board when you don't have one yourself. And a high action based deck would be great to see those in. There's also no archiving to set up any turns, especially if our board gets wiped. So it's going to be a gradual climb back up if that does happen to this deck. So once again, to summarize, this is a bit of a slow deck that wants to hold the board and reach to victory, but there is limited amber control and the control is kind of situational. So overall, I'm going to rate this deck at about a 50. Well, that sums up everything for this display. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, consider liking and subscribing to the channel. For more Keyforge content, check out the other video playlists below or on my page. Feel free to check us out on Team ESP for podcast content. And if you're ever interested in gameplay or whatnot, feel free to message me, leave a comment below. I'm down to potentially play on stream if anybody's interested, just for some more gameplay content. So yeah, hope you guys got some value out of this video. And with that, always remember, be kind and happy forging.